Let me start us off here with a quick word of prayer, and we'll get going. God, we thank you for this evening and the opportunity to study your word. God, we pray that you would let this evening be a blessing to our minds, that we would understand and know you better. That'd be a blessing to our hearts as well, that we would know what it looks like to live like you, and to be more like you, and to take on your character in the ways in which we live. God, patience is a tough conversation, but we're here for it. We want to be a part of it. So God, open our ears, open our eyes, and more importantly, open our hearts that we'll receive your word. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Well, I'm glad you're here, guys. Remember, maybe it's not a remember, maybe it's just the first time you're here. This is the last in-person Wednesday night for a couple of months. Our student programs, and they always want a break for a couple of months, and so I'm going online next week at 6:30. I'm still going to do a study, but it's going to be online, okay? And we're going to be doing the same stuff. We're going to be walking through. And one of the reasons we do it live rather than just tape it in advance is so that if anybody wants to interact, they can type right back to us and we can interact with them, okay? And so that's going to be starting up next Wednesday at 6:30. And so we'll do that, I think, June and July. And then in August, at some point, we'll be starting back up here. But again, the same thing. We'll just be following up on our Sunday morning studies. Yes, Larry. Huh? I think. YouTube. Perfect. Is that right? Is that where the best way? Can you answer back on YouTube?
You can text back and forth.
Because I think the people who are up there are monitoring Facebook.
I think it can probably be done through both.
I'm just not sure about their interacting.
I don't know for sure what it is. Vern, when we do our Wednesday night stuff online, if people want to interact with it, should they go to Facebook or YouTube? Facebook. There we go.
Sorry. It's all right. You can watch it on YouTube.
I think it'll be on YouTube, but it's easier to interact on Facebook. Is that correct?
Yep. Yeah, if you want to talk back, go to Facebook.
And Doc will only monitor YouTube.
I don't monitor any of it. That's why there's always somebody up there with me or a couple other people with me because they do the electronic stuff. Because as you know from my teaching in here, I get distracted, right? And I just keep on going. I learned that I can't do the clicker, and so he does the clicker because I'm never going to be on the right screen, right? And so my mind doesn't multitask well. I get on a task and I just stay right on that one. So now, again, we're following up on what we did on Sunday, and we're dealing with the fruit of the Spirit. The fruit of the Spirit sounds so sweet. People don't like them, okay? Joy, peace, we'd like to have it. We just don't want to do what it costs. Joy, peace, patience. How many people really want patience? I mean, you've heard for a long time, don't pray for patience. If you pray for patience, God's going to get you, right? So you don't pray for it, right? How many of you guys will just utter something like that? I am not a patient man, I'm not a patient woman, and you don't blush. It doesn't embarrass you to say that, right? In fact, you find people that are patient just slovenly. They're just lazy. You admire impatience in a person to a degree. You admire what Jesus calls a sin, right? But we do that with so many of the fruit of the Spirit. Love to be patience, kindness, goodness. How many of you guys want to be 100% good? Don't you want a little bad just so your life will be spiced up a little? Don't you like walking the edge a little just for the mystery of it, the adventure of it, right? It just kind of adds a dimension to it. I'm going to talk about that Sunday. One of the fruit of the Spirit that most people really don't like. We want enough good that God doesn't get us. But we don't want to be obsessed with good, right? There are limits. Patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness. That just sounds wussy. And self-control. How many of you guys really admire a person who's entirely self-controlled? Okay? Sometimes you just want to vent, right? And these are weird, these fruit of the Spirit. And here's one of the things, and this is kind of an interesting principle. The further you are away from God, the less attractive God is. The further you are away from God, the less attractive God's ways are. Okay? We set these things up as a model, and a lot of people say, I don't want that. Because the unspiritual mind can't understand spiritual things. Only as you get closer to God do they become more captivating. Only as you get closer to God does He get more captivating. Okay, it's an odd thing. So these fruit of the Spirit, at first, we kind of stand at arm's length. The more you get to understand God and the more you understand how God thinks, the more beautiful they can become. But if they're not attractive to you, it's probably just because you got some distance between you and God. How's that for meanness? Okay? And I understand that because some of these things, when Paul says, I want to do good, but I can't. I'd like to say that's me. But if I'm perfectly honest, I don't always want to do good. I want to do good. Get the difference? I'd love to want to do good all of the time. So I'm kind of a baby step away from there. Closer you get, then you begin to understand, God's pretty smart, daggone it, right? His way's pretty good. And so God's ways that often seem peculiar, weird, even revolting from the outside, the closer you get to God, the more you understand Him, the more captivating they can become. Does that make sense? You got anything on that, Ben?
This is an incredible introduction to his sermon this Sunday.
It is. It is.
What's fun is we've joked in here about how we kind of gave each other the sermons based on what we were best at. And so that's why he's preaching on patience. Absolutely.
The king.
Hey, stay tuned for humility. It's coming, all right?
That's me.
Also,
the king.
But this week is goodness. So Doc is going to spend a long time talking about badness.
I am.
And it just works really, really well.
Because we like badness better. Yeah. Or at least we like a little bit of badness to taint our goodness. We don't want to be wholly good. We want to have some fun too.
Yeah.
Goodness isn't fun. It's boring. Right? To the unspiritual man, absolutely. That's the case.
You were grounded a lot as a kid, weren't you?
No. To tell you the truth, I was very, very straight-laced because of fear. Not because of love. There's a difference between the two. I feared God. I was terrified at God. And so I walked the straight and narrow. Not because I wanted the straight and narrow, but because I feared God. That's not good. I didn't understand God. I just was afraid of Him. Right? All right, so let's talk about patience. I'm going to do things a little backwards from the way I've been doing it. Usually what I've been doing is making some big statements about the theme and then looking at some verses. Tonight we're going to start out I'm going to run through some big patience verses. And at the end of this thing, I'm going to try to bring out some big ideas. Does that make sense? There'll be a little bit of overlap to what we did on Sunday morning. I don't mind. People usually need to hear something repeatedly before it really begins to make sense. So we're going to go through it a couple times. But basically, I'm just going to walk through some scriptures. First one is, this is the biggest idea. I did introduce this on Sunday morning. This is a refrain that is used of God repeatedly in the Old Testament. I'm not talking about hundreds of times, but you can find it, 9 times, almost exactly the same words, just some minor variations, all through the different strata of the Old Testament. You can find it in Moses, you can find it in David, you can find it in the prophets. This is just a theme that runs through the Old Testament. It's really, really big. You, God, are a God who is merciful. You're gracious. You're slow to anger. Slow to anger. And the reason I have that in yellow, excuse me, that means patient. Okay? Literally in Greek, the word for patience in the fruit of the Spirit, I showed it on Sunday, is makrothumia. Makro means long. Thumia means anger, rage. Okay? What it means is instead of being short-tempered, He's long-tempered. He's not quick to anger. He doesn't have that flash anger. He doesn't go get you the minute you do something wrong. Aren't you glad? Because if God was quick-tempered, this would be an empty room. Right? Okay? If God gave us what we deserved when we deserve it, this would be an empty room. I don't think there's any disputing that. So we are grateful that God is slow to anger. He's patient. We're going to see a couple verses from here of what that means, why he's so patient. Okay? But this is just a quality of God. He's abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. Okay? Huge concept in the Old Testament. God is these things. By the way, just looking at this, it dawned on me, Ben. When we're looking at grace in the Old Testament, we're going to have to come back to this verse right here. Our next series is going to be on grace. We've been preaching on truth for about 2 years now, so we figured it's a time for a dose of grace. And we're going to do it weirdly because we're going to preach grace in the Old Testament. Most people see grace in the New Testament only, and they don't see the God of grace in the Old Testament. Well, the Old Testament pictures that God of grace. It just doesn't use the terms like the New Testament does. But we're going to come back to that one. All right, that's the first verse. It's foundational. Here's the second one. And this is also out of Psalms. Be still before the Lord. Wait patiently for him. Don't fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Now, here's the idea. This is interesting, okay? You're not only patient with people, you got to be patient with God. When it says wait patiently, it's not talking about patience with people. Wait patiently. Be still before the Lord. Wait patiently for him. Wait on God. Have you ever been impatient with God? Have you ever wanted God to do something for you and he didn't do it as fast as you wanted or the way that you wanted? Have you ever prayed for that? Have it ever made you disillusioned with God, depressed in your spiritual life? Because God just simply won't play on your playing field. He won't play your agenda. And he says, wait patiently for God. Let him be God. Right? He might have reasons for the way he's doing stuff that you don't get. And God doesn't have to explain himself to us. Right? Trust him. That's what this means. Trust him. He may not act the way you want, when you want, but trust him. This is a huge, huge idea. You got anything on that one, Ben, that you want to comment on? All right, let's go to the next one then. These are two from the book of Proverbs, and I didn't spend a lot of time there, but there's some stuff in Proverbs that is just cute. This is practical wisdom. You know that this stuff works. Hot heads stir up conflict. Patient people calm down strife. You ever seen that happen? Hot heads aren't the one to come in and to settle an argument unless you want someone hurt. Right? Hot heads stir up conflict. Of course they do. Patient people can calm them down. Patience leads to understanding. Impatience leads to stupidity. How many of you guys have ever made a stupid mistake because you're impatient? I work on a lot of stuff. I don't know anything about working on stuff, okay? I do woodwork stuff. I try to fix my car. I do all kinds of stuff, all right? Just because I figure I can figure it out. So I do it. But I take shortcuts all the time. And when you take shortcuts, when you really don't know what you're doing, you know what you get at the end? A mess. Okay? My impatience costs me constantly when I'm fixing stuff. So I save money about 50% of the time, and it costs me more money about 50% of the time because I'm not patient enough to get the full instructions before I just get started. I read enough that I think I know what I'm going to do, and I just take off, right? Now, you may not be as stupid as that, but I do that a lot, okay? Impatience breeds stupidity. Been there, done that many, many times. It's just practical wisdom, of course. Okay? You got anything on that, or anybody you?
Yeah, well, I'm certainly stupid in this as well. But one of the interesting things here is that sometimes, and I think this connects back with what you talked about Sunday morning, sometimes we say we're being patient, but really what we're doing is we're being lazy. or we're just choosing, we're like frozen. We won't make a decision. We won't act. And so sometimes instead of just jumping in and getting something done and showing impatience that way, sometimes we have a fake patience, but in reality, we're just putting something off.
Absolutely.
Right? And so there's kind of that counterfeit version of this that creeps up as well.
There's several counterfeit versions. Apathy is one of the big ones.
Yeah.
Laziness and apathy. Let's look at the next one. We're going to go to the New Testament. This is Romans 12, and it just states something that's kind of a no-brainer, but we got to notice it. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction. Now, if there's no affliction, why would you need patience? Okay? I am really, really patient when everything's going my way. I don't have a problem at all. Okay? But occasionally the world doesn't revolve around me. That's humor, guys. You can chuckle. Okay? Occasionally it doesn't. When the world doesn't revolve around you, in fact, not only does it not revolve around me, but there are people who are just flat out ornery around me. And if people, I looked right at you, Steve. You notice that. If people are ornery, right, when they sin, when affliction happens, that's when patience is required. This stuff's easy when everything is good. Okay? It's funny. I won't name names, but it's easy to be submissive when you agree with what they want you to do. You're not being submissive, you just agree. Submission only counts when you don't agree. Do you get it? Patience only counts when you don't agree, when it's hard. You don't test patience when things are good. It's affliction. That's a big idea.
Well, it's like when people tell me how tall I am, and that's a unit of measurement that only exists in comparison. Tall doesn't really exist. If everyone were my height, we wouldn't all be tall. We'd be normal, right? Like the fact that short people exist is what makes me tall.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like
but short people have no reason to exist.
I've heard that before. Without my wife, Christina, I wouldn't be tall, all right? So there's those things. It's the same kind of concept here. Patience doesn't exist without the challenge of patience.
Exactly.
There has to kind of be that opposite end. There has to be that thing that causes us to not want to be patient, for patience to exist.
That just caused me a squirrel moment. My grandson, Stephen, is dating a girl who's about 2 feet tall. Okay, now that's a wee bit of an exaggeration, okay? So the first time she came over to the house, I asked her if she'd ever heard the song, "Short People Have No Reason to Live." It just seemed right. You guys know that song? Oh, it's hilarious. You got to know that song. Okay, let's go to the next. Let's go to the next one. We who are powerful need to be patient with the weak. Okay? This is a big thing. Okay? What you had in the both in the Romans context as well as in the Corinthians context is you had some people who had a very robust faith who were eating food that those with weak faith thought was tainted. Now, I know this is a weird thing. It's hard for us to grasp. But back then, they had idol temples. And oftentimes, they would take the meat to the idol temples, the animal to the idol temples to be sacrificed. And they'd bring the meat home and eat it. Some of the Christians said, well, that's worshiping idols. And some of the Christians said, no, it's not. It's steak. I don't care where it came from. It's just steak. Nothing to do with that God. And those who were strong were impatient with the weak for not recognizing that it's only meat. And he tells the strong particularly, be patient with the weak. So if you will admit that you are weak, you have more reason to be impatient. If you think you are strong and you are right, then you are bound to exercise patience with people who aren't with you yet. Does that make sense? Strength, people who are stronger need to take this even more seriously than people who are weaker. People who are weaker, oftentimes, they're not patient, they're just weak. People who are stronger need to be patient. So if you consider yourself strong, this is for you. Don't flip it around. Okay? It's a fascinating concept to me.
I think that is how our culture sees it, is flipped around. People in position of power have the authority to demand things right now. And if you're in a position of service, then you're the one who has to be patient with the person in authority. That sounds like almost every work environment I've ever been in. Until with you, you're amazing.
Until what?
Until with you, you're amazing. Yeah. But outside of working with Doc, the position, you know what I'm saying. I mean, you guys have that. You have your bosses, and typically speaking, the people in authority don't tend to be the ones who are the most patient, are they?
They don't have to be.
They don't have to be, because they're in charge. If they don't like it, they can get rid of you or whatever else. And then you have to be patient with having to deal with someone who's a bear to deal with, right? And so that's the burden. And yet, when it comes to Christian family and how we care for one another and treat one another, it's the opposite. Which, speaking as a pastor, sometimes it's a real challenge to be patient with you guys, right?
Put it in the context.
With each other.
Put it in the context of family. When you have a baby, do you expect your baby to be patient? Or are you supposed to be patient with the child? The stronger being patient with the weaker. We flip that around eventually. It's not Christian. Okay? What's the next one? Colossians 3. This one's huge. Okay? This is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible because of this right here. Since God chose you to be the holy people that he loves, and he has, you must, imperative orders, clothe yourselves with tender-hearted mercy, be merciful, with kindness, with humility, like me. That was humor. With gentleness, with patience. How? I almost think that this verse spells out how some of this happens. Okay? How? By making allowance for each other's faults and by forgiving those who offend you. Now, there's two different levels there. Okay? Making allowance for faults and forgiving when they offend. A lot of people around you are annoying, but they're not trying to sin against you. Right? And we tend to be, in fact, our culture values thin skins. Make them apologize. Look for an apology. Who's the most offended? Because they've got the most power. The whole culture that we have right now, where you are easily wounded, looking for an apology and trying to get even, is counter-Christian. We don't play the victim game. We don't try to figure out who is owed the most. We owe, all of us, equally to our God. Okay? We don't play those games in the church. That's why we pursue the same thing that they pursue, but we do it God's way. God's way works. Their way won't. It will not work. Okay? Now, this term, this one here, making allowance for each other's faults, is the word I like using for it is magnanimity, which basically is have this big soul. I mean, there's some people that if you say something that was a little bit sharp, some people will just hold a grudge, other people will blow it off. What he's saying is blow it off, right? Be a big-souled person. Don't be thin-skinned, okay? Don't be easily wounded. People around you make mistakes. People around you sin, but they're not sinning against you, but sometimes you get caught up in the wake, right? Okay. Don't look for apologies. Don't look to be wounded. Be a big person. Overlook pettiness. Okay? People who are offended by all pettiness, they're always in some battle with somebody. Someone's always hurt their feelings. Quit having such fragile feelings. We're Christians, right? We're not easy to wound. However, occasionally people sin big, and they hurt you, and they come after you. Forgive anyone who offends you, which is countercultural, isn't it? We don't forgive in our culture. We cancel in our culture. That's not Christian. Okay? Our cancel culture is anti-God in my mind. All right? We make allowance for faults and we forgive. That doesn't mean we don't hold people to the consequences. That doesn't mean we don't call sin, sin, because we do. It's grace and truth. Okay? But we are people who are willing to let God settle the accounts. We don't have to settle them all. We trust him. Okay? Huge, huge concepts. That if we could get that, it would change this place, it would change our homes, it would change our workplaces. Okay? Amazing concepts. You got something on that, Ben?
Yeah, I got kind of two big things. I want to draw your attention to this last part. Remember, the Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. Okay, everything's flowing out of this. If you jump back up to kind of this list here, it sounds a lot like the fruit of the Spirit: mercy, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. And then I'm going to go back all the way to the first slide here. You, O Lord, our God, merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love, faithfulness. What you're seeing here is you're seeing the fruit of the Spirit, but they're the fruit of the Spirit because it's natural to the Spirit's nature. It's who God is. One of my favorite things whenever I'm working with students, especially when you talk about issues of sin and what it is to do what's right, one of the things we have to come to terms with is that God isn't just up there like arbitrarily deciding what he thinks is good and what he thinks is evil. It flows naturally from who he is.
Huge.
So when he says, I want the Spirit to be active in you and I want there to be fruit, there are evidences that the Spirit is active in your life. What it's going to produce is the character of God, because that's the work that it does. These aren't just arbitrary things. It's not just random characteristics that God thinks that we ought to have. What God says is, this is who I am and this is who I want you to be as well. And it all flows together, which then connects us back to the last part of this. Remember, the Lord forgave you. All of this is flowing from what God has done. It all flows from who he is, and then it's a calling for us as his children to be the same.
Good. Three more verses, and then we'll move on to some of the big ideas. Next one is from James, okay? And we're talking about, again, patience with God, but for a little different reason. Not everybody, because most people, I think when the early Christians, they used the phrase Maranatha, which is an Aramaic phrase which means come, Lord, right? Come. We want Jesus to come back, but not yet. We're rarely ready in our minds. Sometimes people go through so much pain, so much affliction, that they say, I wish he'd just come. It happens. And then sometimes people say, but if he comes, I've got a kid that I love so dearly and he's not a Jesus follower. If he comes now, my son dies. Separated from God. And these Christians who are just so excited about Jesus coming back, sometimes the way they talk means they just don't love anybody. It's all about me. I want to be spared the affliction, but I don't care about the people around me. So it's a weird concept, but one of the things that it says here is, be patient until the coming of the Lord. You see how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, being patient about it until it receives the early and late rains? You be patient. Be patient with God. Establish your hearts, stay faithful, because he's coming. Okay? It's going to happen. Wait for it. And you said, well, it's been 2,000 years. No. Time is little to God. Right? It's really, really little. 2,000 years is nothing to an eternal God. Right? Now look at this next one. And this kind of tells you why God is so patient. He says in 2 Peter, do not overlook this one fact, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years. 1,000 years is 1 day. He's not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness. Rather, here's why. He's patient. Because he doesn't want anyone to perish. If you knew, let's say your child is separated from God. And let's say you actually love your child. Okay, we'll just take that as a possibility. You love your kid. If you knew for a fact that Jesus was coming back tomorrow, would you be scared for your kid? Would you want more time for your kid? So does God. As much as you love your child, he loves them more. All right? As much as anybody loves you, God loves you more. Infinitely more. God is not eager for the day when he comes back and has to separate eternally some of his children from him because they have chosen not to do life with him. That is not a day, I think, that God is looking forward to. It's going to happen because he's just. He has to. Or else sin wouldn't matter. But he's not eager for it. This is a bad example because I know some of you will be exceptions. I hope when you were a parent, you didn't love disciplining your kid. I hope you did it, but I hope it hurt you. Do you understand what I'm saying? We were brutal. We spanked, right? If you enjoy spanking your kid and making them cry, there's something wrong with you. Sometimes in parents, they get into this rage and they don't think rationally. That's a bad place to be. God is never acting out of rage. If you're not enraged and you're just simply doing what you know has to be done, it still hurts to hurt a kid, doesn't it? Even if it has to be done. Think of it in this kind of terms when you talk about he's waiting. He's trying to be patient because he wants his kids to come around. He's not going to force them. God will not force anybody to love him. But he's trying. He's trying to get them to love him. Okay? That's the idea. Questions, comments on that one? Last one. And that is 2 Timothy 4:2. And I'm not going to do it just because it seems self-serving. That's not why I threw this up here. But because there's a principle here that any of you guys needs to know as you teach, because all of you guys are teachers. You teach your kids. You teach your friends. You teach. Okay? There are contexts in which people are trying to learn from you. Have you ever taught somebody and you've told them that and they didn't get it and it frustrates you? Man, I told you that. I told you, right? All right? Do you know why? Because these are really, really thick. And just telling a person once is probably not going to stick. When I was a coach, I coached soccer for a number of years. I ran the same drills every single practice. Talk about boring, right? Every single practice, I made them just do basic little footwork. Basic little passes, passing with their heads, that kind of stuff. It was just every single practice. Because you do it once, it's not going to stick, right? You try to teach them a new pattern. You got to repeat that pattern until they get it. First you understand it, then it becomes part of you, right? As I taught students Greek. Talk about painful, right? And but you go back over the same mistakes over and over and over again until eventually they start to get it. And it goes from book learning to now understanding. Now I begin to understand. Have you ever had an idea and you've known it for a long, long time, but all of a sudden a light bulb goes off and now you don't just know it here, but you understand it. It makes sense to you. Okay? Preach the word. Be ready to do it whether it's convenient or inconvenient. Correct, confront, encourage with patience. Okay? I remember Randy telling me about an evangelist who came to do a revival at a little church where he was a very young man. Randy's just slightly older than I am, so it was about 80 years ago, right, that he was pastoring this small church, his first pastorate. And he had this evangelist come in. And back then, they would go and visit different homes of people who were not yet Christians. So they went into this person's home, and the evangelist laid out the gospel to this guy. And the guys, he asked him, "Are you ready?" "Not yet. I'm thinking on it. I'm thinking hard on it." I want to process. And the evangelist said, then go to hell. And he stood up and walked out of the house. Okay? He didn't respond. And so he was done with him. He shook the dust off his feet. That was it. Okay? And he said it was one of the worst pastoral things he's ever observed in his life. It was awful. Okay? Stats used to say, I don't know if they still hold, I read this years and years ago, that it takes 7 significant confrontations with the truth before a person really bends to it. You need repeated nudges towards Jesus before you can actually, you can't expect to go to a person the first time, present the gospel, and then automatically they become Jesus followers. It can happen, but typically it takes repeated nudges. With your kids, be patient. Keep telling them the truth. When they don't get it, tell them again. When they don't get it, tell them again, right? One of these days they'll get it here, and if they keep processing it, someday they'll get it here. They'll make it their own. That's the idea, okay? Pretty good verse. You got anything on that, Ben? Okay, so what we're going to do now is just change directions. We've looked at a bunch of verses. They're not all of the verses in the Bible. It was a selected set. But I want to just draw out some of the big ideas, most of which we have already mentioned. Okay? This is what we need to take. Number 1. And patience requires adversity. Patience. Did you do this slide? He's lying. I did the slide.
Please be patient with me.
Patience requires adversity. Put your hand over that I am.
This is an adverse moment, and we're going to test the patience.
Computer error. Without adversity, there's no need for patience. Just remember, okay, the world doesn't revolve around you, and you're surrounded by sinners. That's enough to realize that you're going to live in adversity. For you to dream of not living in a broken world and not being surrounded by sinners is a pipe dream. It is not reality. You will face adversity, like it or not. Okay? You're not going to like it, but you're going to face it. And you can rage against it, and you can try to build this little bubble where you're not facing it, but then you're not in the world. Right? You are surrounded by people who make mistakes. You are surrounded by people who sin. You're going to have adversity. Bottom line.
And we know this intuitively because this is why we joke about praying for patience, because we know that it will bring adversity, and we don't want it.
There are always people that are going to drive more slowly than me, right?
I think that's true.
All right. Number 2. This one really bothers me. We value impatience even more than we value patience. You buy that? We're proud of it. I'm not a patient man. I get things done. Don't get in the way. We have things to do, right? We value impatience. We mock people who are too patient. It's amazing how it's not even an attractive value to us. And the less attractive it seems to you, the more distance there is between you and God. That's my indictment. Maybe inaccurate, but that's what I think's going on. Okay? Does that make sense? That's a hard one, isn't it?
I think this is kind of a cultural idea. I think this fits really well with the idea of like the American dream. People don't get the American dream by being patient.
No.
You have to go fight and get it. And that idea has been sold so much that it's made it to where patience is something that we don't even look at anymore.
Next one. Do you ever excuse your sin? Do you ever sin and then you say, but he made me do it? Right? Which is, there's a technical term for that. I can't use the good one. I'll just use the word crap. He made me sin. No one has ever made you sin. Okay? Ever. When you sin, it's because you chose to respond in an ungodly way. Bottom line. They can tempt you to sin. They can tempt you well. They can make it really hard to be godlike. But if you cross the line in sin, that's on you, right? But we make these excuses. I know I was short, but I was tired. Worked all day, had a hard day. Okay? You just happened to be the dog that was laying in my way when I walked in the house. So I kicked you, right? So I was busy, right? I was distracted. Kids were just being so difficult. And that's why I whacked them the way that I did, right? My spouse, she was just cold again. She just didn't respond the way that she should have to her husband, right? And I make my excuses for my impatience. We can always make an excuse for our sin. God will never accept your excuse. You buy that? It's sin. Sin is doing what you know God doesn't want you to do. It's hard sometimes, really, really hard to do life God's way, but it's still your choice. And so I'm bothered by all of the excuses we make for our impatience. I needed to get there fast, and so I ran over that woman in front of me, right? It's hard. You got anything on that one?
I think that if, before this conversation and before hearing the sermon on Sunday, I think if we would have been in a setting where you'd asked me, is impatience a sin? I think I would have wrestled with that. And I think I would have put it in the category of kind of like white lies, right? It's like, we know lying's wrong, but I mean, there's some things that you just shouldn't say to someone, right? So we'll do like the white lies, or kind of the in-between of, it's not really right, but it's not really a sin kind of a thing. And I think I would have kind of thrown impatience into that kind of a category. And I think these excuses we throw out are exactly the same way that we would speak about something else like that. Like it's just not that big of a deal. It's being impatient with someone is a really low-level issue. It's not something that we should make as big of a deal as to call it a sin. Yeah, we just blow it off. And so I think that's what makes, for me this Sunday, the sermon or anything else, it brought some things to my attention and my own eyes, my own thinking within our home of what does it look like to actually be patient with each other, and what are the ramifications of not being patient with each other. Like, this is actually a much bigger issue than just some small little thing that exists. And so this is, for me, with the excuse and everything else, it just kind of goes back to that idea.
Another one that is odd. There is a relationship between pride and impatience, humility and patience. Okay? Impatience basically means the world is not revolving around me and people are not treating me as I deserve. That's impatience. When the world does not bend to me, my agenda, my needs. When you think the world revolves around you, that's a word for pride. So I think there's a connection between pride and impatience. Okay? People need to understand that I'm more important than they are. That's humor, guys. You can chuckle. Okay? It's nonsense. But that's what impatience is. I need to be first, not you. Right? I deserve to get there first. You're in my way. That's a pride issue. At least it's related to it. I don't know if it's entirely pride, but there's got to be a connection between, in my mind, impatience and pride, which is why there has to be a connection between humility and patience. They've got to be connected. Okay? Next piece. Relationship to love. And I'm not sure what this connection is. Okay. One of the things we said at the beginning of this series, and Ben and I have both gone back and forth from it, this idea, is that all of the fruit of the Spirit are interconnected. In fact, probably the most important fruit of the Spirit is love. And if you actually love, all of the rest of these just naturally come. If you love God and love people, then joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control, all that stuff's going to be there, right? If you don't love, these things are going to be hard. I mean, that interconnection is pretty obvious. Patience and love go together. However, I could argue against myself on this one, and I did. I made that case, and I said patience flows out of love. But I also know that sometimes people we love, we are more impatient with. Okay? I am more impatient with my child's failures than your child's failures. Because I love them. Closer to them. That doesn't make sense. So there's a relationship, but I don't know what it is.
That could be pride too, because they're a reflection of you and your parents.
That's a possibility, but there's another one coming down here. As a parent, you have a right to set high standards for your children. Okay? You have not only a right, but you have a responsibility to hold your kids responsible to those high standards, because our job as parents is to civilize barbarians. Your kids are barbarians. If they don't get stripped of some of these really, really bad habits when they're young, these bad habits are going to kill them when they get older. We have a responsibility to train up our kids in the way they should go, right? And so patience doesn't mean you can't set high standards. Patience doesn't mean you can't hold your kids accountable to those standards. Somehow you've got to balance those things. Patience is necessary with your children. But that doesn't mean you lower the bar, the standards that you set for them. You can't do that. Patience doesn't mean you can't hold them accountable. You can't discipline your kids. You can't correct them, just like that verse that we read about preaching. Correct, right? It's part of the job. Point out sin, hold them accountable. And so the relationships are complex. Yes, love is related to patience. But sometimes it's easier to get impatient with those that we love because we have a right to set expectations. But when do we get too rigorous on that? You got to understand that your kids are going to fail. I have watched too many little league dads, okay, who are awful dads because they want high standards for their kids, but they forget that kids make mistakes and they brutalize them for being children. That's child abuse. You believe that? I did an experiment. I've got time for it. This is a side path. It's utterly irrelevant, but it just explains the idea. I've always coached college, but one season I coached children playing baseball, like one of their first season or two of baseball. They're awful, okay? Watching a little kid play baseball is a lot like watching your 5-year-old draw, all right? They are pathetic. But I got the parents together at the beginning of the season, and this is not something I lived with my college kids. With my college kids, I would just rip them up, okay, if they were just messing up, because I know better. But I took the parents aside and I said, okay, we're going to do an experiment. Nobody criticizes any child here for failure, except failure to behave. If they don't listen, they raise a ruckus, we'll scold them. If they make a mistake, first thing we'll say to them will always be a word of encouragement. That was a good try. Next time, put the glove just a little bit lower and you'll have it next time, right? But I said, we'll do an experiment. No parent can jump on their kid. Well, I'm not going to let you stay in the stands, right? No parent can jump on the refs. Nobody's going to criticize the kid without praise first, and then it's going to be coaching, not criticism, all right? It was the first year I coached, so I got all the misfits. All the other coaches picked the kids they knew could play, right? I was the guy who didn't know any of the kids. So I was assigned the misfits. We were terrible. We finished up second in the league because the kids just thrived. They were coached. They were corrected, right? But we tried to exercise patience with them, and they thrived. In fact, they would make a mistake. They'd come over and look at me with these eyes, hoping for a word of encouragement rather than a word of You just blew it, dude. Little kids. And you'd give them that word of encouragement, and you just see their faces melt. And then you'd coach them. Next time, do this. Next time, do this. You're going to do better next time. Well, think of that. Something around that is kind of what we're trying to do with our kids. Now, I'm not saying that's the only time I ever did it, okay? It worked. I never tried it again with college kids, okay? I wasn't good at it. That was a one-year experiment, one time. I didn't do it with my own kids. I didn't do it with my college kids. But it can work. There's a couple of ideas there that can work. That was the side road. This next one, my daughter, after Sunday, she came up to me and she said, I never connected forgiveness and magnanimity to patience in my mind. She said, I never just put them together. And what I suggested is the key to patience is magnanimity and forgiveness. You can't separate them. If you can't forgive, you can't be patient. If you can't be magnanimous, you can't be patient. If you go around looking to be wounded, if you go around like a little snowflake, right? You cannot be patient with people who hurt you. And she said, I never connected the two. That's something I think we need to understand as a church. What we need to be, first of all, is magnanimous, which means that we're not easily wounded. We've got these big, big souls. And number two is if someone really does need forgiveness, we need to be willing to let God settle the scores and not take it in our own hands. Okay? God will bring about justice. He'll bring about just as much justice with them as he's going to bring with you. I want God to be ruthless with the people who hurt me. I want him to be generous with me. I got to trust God to be God and to be smart enough to work it out, right? So when you're thinking about how to be patient, think magnanimity and forgiveness, and that'll open all kinds of doors for you. Got anything on that, Ben?
This whole conversation on patience, and this is, I don't know, I feel weird about this, but I've been in church my whole life. I've been preaching in ministry for almost 20 years. And these are conversations like I've not even worked through myself. Like these, I feel almost embarrassed. This feels like new ideas to me. And even talking about patience in these kind of terms, because I think patience is such a low-level issue, or we've made it into such a small thing that we don't even talk about it in terms of it being sin. We don't talk about the things that it's actually connected to. And all these things that we're going through, intuitively, I know that what you're saying is true. I've just never put the mental capacity to think through these kinds of things before. But you're absolutely right. There's a huge level of patience when it comes to forgiving. Within a marriage relationship, I think of my wife. I think of the context of a relationship to love. I promise that there's no one in the world that I've been more impatient with than my wife. At the same time, I've never shown more patience to any human in the world than my wife. And so there's however true that is for me to her, it's 100 times more for her towards me. But there's just all these things I think are so intuitive and they're right on track. It's just stuff that I hadn't really ever taken the time to mentally think through before.
You figure the fruit of the Spirit, and you already made the point earlier, Ben, all they are is he's trying to cultivate godliness in us. This is how God is. Can you imagine if God was as patient with you as you are with the people in your life? Okay? What if God just lives by your standards? You'd be hosed. Every one of you. And he's trying to cultivate godliness. This is just image of God. Fruit of the Spirit is just image of God. He's trying to make us into the image of Jesus. This is what we were created to be. We were to be, in my image, I created them. Genesis 1:26, go back and read it. You were created in God's image. Your life works best when you live it according to God's image. When you do life with God, for God, God's way, that's when life works best. That's when you taste joy and peace, all of those things. Okay? This is so big. This is just godliness. We minimize them. These fruit of the Spirit, we blow them off. You don't want God to blow them off? Do you want God to be as faithful to you as you are to him? Do you want God to love you as much as you love him? okay? He's trying to cultivate godliness in us. This stuff is huge.
And so there's also this correlation. When we downplay the importance of patience, we're robbing ourselves of the power of patience. We're robbing, and again, I think intuitively we get this because we really want people to be patient with me, right? Like I need patience because I know I've got my problems and I've got my flaws, and I really need you to just calm down and be patient with me. I'm trying to figure this out. But we don't treat people the other way around. We miss that out. And we know, you probably know, like it's even the illustration of you coaching those kids. You know the power that's been given to you when someone was patient and kind and encouraging to you, and they listened to you, and they helped you along, and you knew you didn't deserve the extent of patience that they gave you, but you're grateful for the power that had in your life. And then we will, on the flip side, act like if I lose my temper with the McDonald's drive-through person because they didn't get my fries out fast enough, that's not that big a deal. And so there's just, we downplay the value of patience until we're the ones getting the patience.
Speaking of McDonald's, you know what really tests my patience? It's when I get to the window first and they go to the other car on the other window and let them order first. I just sit there and stew. I'm not good at this stuff. I know a lot here on some of these things. I'm terrible right here, guys. I'm just telling you. This is hard stuff.
It happened to me at Chick-fil-A today. I was in that double drive-through, and I ordered and pulled up, and then some car, because it's got the two, and so off to my right, there's an empty lane, but I haven't got to where it comes into one lane yet. And then this car finishes ordering, and they come all the way up, right, even with us. And my 13-year-old son looks at me and he goes, "Are they going to take your spot?" And I'm like, "I guarantee they aren't." And so we had a little standoff there, and I got my food in order. But it was...
Don't you want God to do some smiting sometimes?
Oh, man, yeah. Yeah, as long as I'm not the one who needs to be smited. Yeah.
That's it. That's right there. I want to skip this next thing because we already talked about it. I'll go back to it a sec. Patience doesn't mean you can't set high standards and hold people accountable to it. That's really important. Okay, we try to do this here at the church. We want high standards for our people, and we hold them accountable to them. It's important.
And on the flip side of that, patience doesn't mean lowering standards or expectations so that they can hit it. It works both ways.
Yes, absolutely. This next one is where I want to end it, really. The last one we don't need, we've already done it. But it's impatience with God. It's something I didn't deal with at all on Sunday. It was in my notes. I just didn't have time to play with it. Okay? But we get impatient with God a lot, basically because he won't answer our prayers our way. He won't answer our desires our way. He won't go by our agenda. And in my mind, it's a battle of control. Do I serve God or does God serve me? Right? I want God to serve me. I kind of want to be God and let him be my help. That's what's behind that. And it's hard because it's easy to get impatient with God because we don't always understand why he does what he does, when he does what he does, right? And so it's really, really hard. But basically, patience with God just requires trust. He is smarter than I am. He is gooder than I am. I said that for Connie. Where is she? He's gooder than I am. She hates that word. Okay? She thinks I should say better. But I say gooder because it annoys her. Okay? He's smarter than I am.
It's because you're helping her with her patience.
I'm helping her with her patience. I'm trying to...
Adversity and patience. Yeah, he did.
She even hates it worse when I say the word wuss. She hates the word wuss. Okay? And so I also throw it into sermons periodically just to annoy her. Because she sits at the desk there in the office and annoys me. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so I'm getting her back.
You're mutually fulfilling adversity to one another. Yes. It's a beautiful relationship.
That's all. I'm done. You got anything left?
I've got nothing else. Any questions, any thoughts real quick before we just close out?
I think a lot of this is related to the sermon that you preached, Ben, on being an ambassador. When you think about how
Absolutely. And again, if we're going to connect this back to God, if God is that patient with us and now we're his representatives, how dare we not be patient with one another? Whether that's within the family or whether even outside of the family. If we're trying to draw people to God, but we're impatient with them, that's not going to get anywhere. Mike?
I just wanted to say, since this is the last session for the summer, thank you to you and Doc for Wednesday nights. I've gotten a lot out of it. I'm sure everybody else
Yeah.
is too.
Cool.
Well, good.
Thank you, guys.
I got a text from Vern. First of all, I got a text from my friend Johnny back there to make sure that I passed out the sign-in sheet. So that was helpful. I appreciate it. It's right there. I know it's there. So that's beginning class. I appreciate it. And then I also got a text from Vern saying that you can type in comments on the YouTube on the Wednesday nights coming up as well. So whether you watch on Facebook or YouTube, you'll be able to interact with us as we're teaching those classes and be able to pose your questions, make your comments, all that wonderful kind of stuff. And while I'm teaching, you feel free to send me texts and let me know stuff because that's helpful. Bob?
I just want to say that this was amazing, and I'd like to hear more about it.
Well, we're going to,
I mean, just kind of like being,
Yeah.
unreal how good it is.
no matter how deep you get into this thing, there are depths below you.
Yeah.
God's kind of like that. All you can ever do is scratch the surface and then scratch it a tiny bit deeper, but there's always more.
Yeah. There's a real richness here that doesn't get talked about a whole lot. Yeah.
You know, some of the people that we're impatient with, like the cashier at the checkout, they're probably the one person that is thriving and needing our patience more than
You got it.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, and that's so it goes back to we love when people are patient with us. If you've ever been in customer service, if you've ever been in a situation where something wasn't working out the way that it needed to, and someone's watching on you and waiting for you to meet their need, you know how much it meant to you when they didn't get upset with you and they just smiled and they were kind and appreciative to you. You know what a relief of stress that was off of your life. And so then for especially for a Christian to treat someone poorly in that kind of a situation because it's not worked out, that's unfortunate. So, all right, I'll pray. If you guys want to talk some more, come on up. God, we thank you so much again for this evening, this opportunity. God, this has been a rich conversation. And God, more than anything right now, we just want to thank you for your patience. God, you have been patient with me. You continue to be patient with me. God, I test your nerves. I know it's true. But your love is unfailing. Your kindness to me continues to persist. And I'm so grateful. God, help me to be more like you. God, I pray your spirit would be active in my life, that I would resemble and represent you in this world in a way that brings you glory and honor. And we're grateful for your son, Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen.